Hello, and welcome to the beginning of the end, the ephemeral period that is 2024, or should I say the rest of our lives in general, is closing in fast. I don't know how it is the end of October. Spooky season came and went in a blink, to the point where I was hoping this was going to be a spooky month. I have one spooky book, and the book wasn't even that spooky. So the whole month was a fucking fraud. I read 7 books, technically. 2 of them I started in September and finished them very early in October. So really, I read 5.
You stopped and I was like, is that the end of the video? I read 5 books.
I read 5 books. Goodbye. This is a month of 2 halves. We start very strong and we peter out very heavily. So let's begin with the good stuff. I read Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky, my first Tchaikovsky book. This will be a discussion that Grace and I and Murphy and Bryce have at some point in the future, in our continuing reading a book like once a quarter together or something. So I won't go into it too much, but I will say is that it was a very strong book. I really enjoyed Guns of the Dawn. I gave it 4.5 stars. I need to remember the name. Yes.
Guns of the Dawn.
This follows Emily Marshwick, who is a kind of lady of leisure in this fantasy version of what is essentially England. Essentially, the neighbouring society invade, and throughout the beginning of the book, we follow life with Emily as this war begins, as certain people in her life leave, as the society comes to terms with the fact that they are at war, and eventually the call comes in. It's the first draft of women, and she goes to the front to fight. That is the kind of elevator pitch. It's a very concise view of it. It's a very different book than how that sounds for most of it. And it grows. That it's a very slow burn book. It takes a long time in the actual her daily life, what she's doing, her relationships. That is all definitely needed to build the foundations of her life and who she is. So then when she does go to war, we see the change within her, the change within everyone. And all of that is incredibly solid. I like the beginning threw me, honestly, because to give the first chapter, the first chapter is that we are in the war, and it's this kind of really action heavy scene that is really intense, very cool, drawing imagery from World War One and Vietnam and all this crazy stuff, and it's really evocative. And then we go back to her just at home before the war and everything, before she's involved. And I personally always dislike when a book does that. Nothing irritates me more than the feeling like I'm waiting to get to a scene, because that's kind of always the inciting incident, or something that you're kind of you I don't know, I just always feel like I'm waiting for it, and I always wish they didn't exist, because to me the scene adds nothing at that point, because we don't know who Emily is. We become invested in who Emily is there, so then when we go back, I find myself just waiting to eventually catch up. Whereas, if that scene was in its natural place, I understand that some people wouldn't like the slow burn aspect if we didn't have that opening scene. And do you know what I say to those people? Don't be a fucking idiot then. Enjoy the slow burn. Enjoy reading the book and experiencing these characters and organically experiencing that evolution and change and that overwhelming moment that's at the beginning of the book in the actual chronological time, rather than being like, okay, I can stick through with this because eventually we'll get to the action. Sometimes you wait for the good stuff, and if you can't wait, you don't deserve to have the good stuff. So that's my that was the problem with the opening of the book, which is a very small thing that 99% of people won't have. I am just a pedantic asshole with those particular scenes. They just don't work for me. But from there, Emily is an incredibly strong character. I really loved following Emily. I really enjoyed her journey. Um, it's a very bleak book, a very barbaric book in a lots of ways, a very thoughtful book. Tchaikovsky can definitely just create these evocative scenes of some of the most disgusting imagery in terms of war. Um, and it's the whole book is about the kind of pointlessness of war, the waste of life, and as a result, it draws from wars that we can directly relate to those. World War One, the Vietnam War, just these wars that just did nothing than waste bodies. Um, and so for me, I always love a fantasy where I can tell where they're drawing from inspirationally from real life, because I think it always helps tie the themes together. And because you've got the draw from the the World War One and Vietnam imagery, you then have an awareness of probably the direction the book's going to go thematically, and I think that sometimes helps in the journey. And personally, some people will say, "Oh, it's too on the nose." I don't understand. I don't understand why people don't like things to be on the nose. Sometimes signposts are really nice, and Gun to the Dawn has those, and it just does everything the way I wanted it to. There was no big surprises. Honestly, the book pretty much went in the direction I expected it to go throughout. Also had absolutely no problem with that, because sometimes you're like, this is what I want from the book, I hope it does it, and it just did it. And I was like, oh, what a wonderful surprise. It's like the book was written for me apart from the opening chapter. And if all I can complain about is one chapter, then I dare say it's a hell of a good ride. Next up, I read a Canticle for Leibowitz, or Leibowitz, by Walter M. Miller Jr. This is a book that several people have been telling me that I should read. I made a sci-fi recommendations video like a year and a half, 2 years ago, and people referenced in that I should read this. So I finally did, and it was worth the wait. I gave it 4 stars. I have absolutely no idea how to describe this book, other than I would describe it as in the same vein as like a Douglas Adams, which is it's the smartest person you know telling some of the silliest jokes you've ever read. This is a post-nuclear apocalypse world where this society is beginning to bloom and grow again in the Utah desert where they are. They essentially live off the doctrine of artifacts. They're finding these papers, like early in the book, they find a fallout shelter, and inside of it, and it's all to do with Canticle for Leibowitz. Is the whole book deals with the idea of the founding of the sainthood of Leibowitz, which is if you find enough artifacts about this person, they become part of the mythology. And so the entire book deconstructs the kind of the power of religion, the kind of hypocrisy, the way it could be abused, the kind of the way that certain figures inside of it can coerce and shift narrative. People will interpret events and change certain things to make it in line with their vision, or not even the vision of what they think of God, their vision of what they want to be able to have as much power as they can. And all at the same time, it's also dealing with this humour. The best way I can describe it is it's like the Library of Alexandria burned again, and we're watching this future society look back on our time, or like the 1950s, and you can't help but laugh at the interpretations they're making. They worship like blueprints of like engine parts and stuff like that, and they're doing all this stuff, and they're misinterpreting all of these different things, and they're changing things, and they're using Latin is now a language that's come back. The modern English language is dead, and Latin has come back to the forefront, and it creates this kind of narrative line for yourself to look back. And you can't help but it creates this image of what if someone from ancient Greece suddenly rocked up and could see what our lives at the moment looked like, and they'd be like, these are the stupidest people I've ever met. Like, how did they come up with this from what we were doing, and why do they like still read us and put together all these like broken copies of our stuff? and then so heavily misinterpret it. Like, it has that kind of feeling, and it does it so unbelievably well. From everything I've seen online, people love the first part of this book because it was written as 3 novellas, and people love the first one, and then the second 2 not so much. Personally, I loved the second 2 more so than the first one. I think it took me a while to adapt to a very dry writing style. It's very dry and very witty, and you have to be involved. You really have to be in it to appreciate everything. And so I think it took me a while to adapt to that. But by the second one, that there's a kind of reveal at very early on in the second novella that it just had me laughing, and I was on board from there because I was like, oh, this is an incredibly clever book. I would struggle to know who I would recommend the Canticle for Leibowitz for, apart from like diehard sci-fi nerds who know Latin, because the book does just have a lot of Latin with absolutely no translation, and nowhere in this book does it have like a translation area or something. It's not like there's no part of the text that translates it. And I know that there are some people who say you don't need to translate it. I think that's poppycock as part of the book. So there are online resources where people have translated every line of Latin in terms of each chapter. So I did that. I went through and I was reading it. I was reading it on my Kindle, and so I would have the Kindle, and then I'd switch to the different app which had the translation on. So that's how I did it. I would recommend reading the Latin as well. Otherwise, you're a weirdo. Mostly, it's just excerpts from the Bible mixed in with some kind of weird messaging and mixed up things, that kind of thing. It adds to the image of this society that's trying to reinterpret the past in order to have power in the present. Really good. I give it 4 stars. I don't know whether I said that. Then we have 2 5-stars back to back. The first of, well, actually both of these I'm not going to talk about in great detail because I have individual videos on them. The first is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, a reread. I loved it the first time. I loved it more the second time. It is an incredible piece of modernist literature. The stream of consciousness is an incredible feat, and all of the characters are amazing. I love Clarissa and Septimus the most. Incredible. I did do a video where I reviewed the first 4 books in Woolf's bibliography, and I talk about Mrs. Dalloway in a lot more detail there. So if you want to watch that, then feel free. And the other one is that I read The Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wang. I have a dedicated review to that, which is actually coming up today as I record this. But Blood Over Brighthaven is a 5 out of 5 for me. My favourite 2024 release, which I'm not even going to go into. I have the review for a reason. Just know that it's incredible, in fantastic writing, fantastic world building, really interesting magic system, and very nuanced characters that go on a journey. In the Discord, well, actually, that's funny because Blood Over Brighthaven's also one of those. In the Discord, we've been doing a book club. We restarted it. We did it a couple of years ago, and then uni got too busy, so I wasn't able to. So I've come back, and really, it's mostly just me putting a book from either Grace or mine, our TBRs, and then we just have that open so people could talk about it that month as well, or in the future. They're no longer month sensitive, so if you want to pop in later and you're like, oh, I'm reading that book, they were reading that a while ago, you can read our thoughts, or you can put your own in. But Blood Over Brighthaven was on one there. We're currently still doing that in November because it just came out at the end of the month. I just started it a month early because I had the arc and needed to read it. And the other one that was chosen for last month was Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. A book that I have owned for a long time, and Grace has also owned for a long time. I gave Sorrowland 3 stars. I read the whole thing. I enjoyed it. However,
You read the whole thing?
I read the whole thing, every page, apart from like acknowledgements. I do not wish them to acknowledge anyone, apart from me, the reader. Sorrowland follows a character at the beginning of the book who is giving birth in a forest to twins, and they're in this situation where they're running away from this place that they were in, and they're being hunted by a ghoul, possibly a ghoul, a haunting, a ghostly figure, a monster in the dark, and it's a very intense scene as they're running from this creature, as they're giving birth and falling into rivers and all kinds of crazy shit. And essentially the book, it follows this character who has escaped from a cult that she was in, and it's bizarre. I don't even know how to describe it, other than the fact that personally the social commentary was very good and the plot was very good. However, those two things meshed together never quite worked for me for large parts of the book. I was mostly confused and disinterested because of the prose. I wasn't the biggest fan of their prose, and that's purely because it just wasn't engaging to me. It was telling these events in such a disconnected manner that I never quite got involved. However, because it's disconnected, it then has all these flourishes of social commentary. And you yawning over there? You're bored of listening to me?
Yep.
But yeah, it never quite gelled for me. I really enjoyed the climax. The last about 70 pages of this book were really stellar. But I would say the first 100 or so pages, I wasn't that interested. A lot of the stuff that was happening was either so bizarre I didn't understand, or so predictable that it didn't quite draw me in. And that just comes down to who you are as a person. I know this is a well-reviewed book, but for me, it just didn't quite gel. The penultimate book is There by Tommy Orange, which I gave 3.75 stars. I really enjoyed this book. It is by a native author in America called Tommy Orange, and deals with all of these native characters preparing for a powwow, and it gets into essentially it's about modern native lives, rather than focusing on this like antiquated and archaic view of the native community. This deals with modern problems and very real issues, and it has a vast range of characters. There's probably about 14 or 15 major characters in this book that you switch perspectives between, and it creates this mosaic. It's one of those things. It's similar to something like a Girl, Woman, Other, but in a shorter form. Something that is telling a wide range of characters' perspectives to create a mosaic of life for a particular community. And so There does it extremely well. There are certain characters that definitely resonate more than others because it just depends on who you are as a person. There is a particular character who deals with this sense of body image issues, that I was reading that before work one day, and I left it like sweating. Like going into work, I was sweating and just like, God, that actually was such an intense reading experience for me. That definitely Tommy Orange can get into the mind of someone and just put it on a page in a way that is deeply cutting. And so I think I think people, regardless, will find a couple of bits in this book that they just deeply connect with, and then the rest is then a mosaic to have empathy, to think about other people. This is a humorous but extremely melancholic read. It mostly deals with sadness, just this overwhelming confusion around identity, and an erasure of identity, and how to reclaim it, whether you want to, what to draw from the past, what to leave there, and all focusing on the present and the future, how to continue forward. Personally, I was gonna give it 4 stars, and then the ending happened and I had to drop it down a little, purely because I just wasn't the biggest fan. I it was so. I don't know whether it's commentary in the sense that you can see where the book's going the entire time, and so it has this foreboding atmosphere, and whether he's trying to make an analogous comparison there between the idea of that we know where it's going in real life, this idea of like the erasure of society, the erasure of identity, etc. So I don't know whether that's meant to connote the kind of this foreboding sense in the book, but in the end, the book becomes extremely predictable when you finish it, and I was like, oh, I was expecting something more from that. And it's told in a very dispassionate way in the end that left me a little bit disconnected than I wanted to be. So 3.75 stars, still very good. I would recommend it, especially for a debut. And I do want to read Wandering Stars. I want to continue with Tommy Orange's work. And last but not least, I read Our Sheriff Night by Mariana Enriquez, translated by Megan McDowell. And I gave this 3.25 stars, which will probably shock a lot of people. This was the spooky book that took the entire month. I started this mid-October and I finished it on the 31st. It took 2 weeks. It was a journey and a half. I will be getting into this one. This one's one that deserves a lot of conversation. The book is split into 6 parts, and what I did not know going in is that at least 3 of these are essentially their own novellas. There was this feeling for me that each part didn't resolve fully, and that you get this distinct feeling that they are 3 separate stories. I felt like I was constantly getting cut off just before there should be a big thematic resolution. To me, I would much prefer if these were 3 separate novellas, because I think it would have made the author focus more on actually having a consistent through line in each individual book. Have a resolution, have a big climax with a thematic resolution, and then go on to a different story, and maybe have a different thematic through line. Have something that they tie together, but keep them separate. Whereas instead, all of these have a same kind of thematic idea, the same kind of, what does this say about society? And as a result, by the time you're done with 600 pages, you're like, fucking hell. That was a slog. That was a journey. And I don't know whether this is down to translation as well, but some of the phrases just don't make sense in English. Like, they make good enough sense if you don't think about it, but the moment you start thinking about it, you're like, that's not how it would ever be worded. And some of the conversations are a bit janky. Some of them have this feeling of that they are from a different country, different language, and have been translated into English. And I don't know whether that's because the translator just had such an amount to deal with because it's such a long book. I don't know. But I just don't think there was this attention to detail that I would have hoped for. There are certain things that I really enjoyed in this book. I think there's a repetition of this like oxymoronic descriptions that I think are really good. It's a classic, you know. Like, you go back and you're reading romantic poets and they're using the oxymoron, and it's such a great tactic to create this feeling of like unease in horror. Because it keeps you on your toes, it keeps you unbalanced, and so I really enjoyed those. I really loved the characters, really interesting characters. The book begins, you're following a guy called Juan, who is this medium. He is this person who is the conduit of the darkness, this kind of expanding force, this god, this devil, and he is the center of this cult, essentially. That he is traveling with his young son. His wife has passed, and it's like a road trip as he learns about his son, and they're learning about each other. And that's kind of the first part. And the interesting thing about that, is that because you're following someone who is extremely versed in the supernatural elements of the book, at no point do you feel fear or unease or any kind of horror. Instead, it's just him kind of being like, there's a ghost over there. If you don't want to deal with it, just ignore it. And the kid's like, oh, okay. You tell it to go away. And it goes away. And it's like, oh, okay. Now what do we do? There's nothing scary in the slightest. There's no unease. You've removed it. And that's kind of how the book feels to me, is that there are certain like scenes that are incredibly interesting, but they're told in a way which is like, because the characters are sometimes very versed in the horror, that it's not horrific. Instead, it's very run of the mill. And that, to be fair, does fit with the kind of overarching thematic through line of abuse, this kind of normalization, and if the horror being normalized within a family, and as a result, the horror, actual horrific events are also normalized. I understand that from a thematic through point. But until you get to the point where you understand that's what they're doing, what's going on here, bud? So that was my kind of thought. To me, this is not a horror, even though it's advertised as such. This is a supernatural literary drama. That is how I would sell this book. If you think that's interesting, then go for it. It is a chonker. It's one of the slowest paced books I've ever read in my entire life. The second half of the book definitely speeds up. It switches into different perspectives. First person, snappy, you get going. But overall, slow paced, slow burn, not really any horror at all. Interesting characters, but told very dispassionately and very disconnectedly. And that's kind of my thoughts. It was not as good as I was hoping it would be. But the book is incredibly well reviewed. I think it has like 40,000 ratings on Goodreads and a 4.27, which is absolutely bananas. I was expecting this book to have maybe a 3.7, 3.8, because I thought there would be a lot of people who tried to read this and DNF'd it 20% through and were like, 1 star, this sucks, it's boring. I'm surprised that isn't there. Maybe that will eventually come if the book gets big enough, but God.
Maybe people who DNF'd it didn't read it.
Well, that's what I was also thinking. I was thinking that maybe that the people who DNF'd it just...
I know there are some people that'll be like, I read 5 pages of this and I hated them, 1 star.
Yeah.
But I feel like most people aren't
wild
enough to do that.
That's true. But yeah, incredibly well reviewed. But for me, it was good. Like, I gave it 3.25 stars. I know for a lot of people they're like, oh my god, he thought it was the biggest pile of shit I've ever read. But no, 3.25 for me is actually like, that was a good book. And I appreciated a lot about it. I just didn't quite connect to get it up to that 4 star and higher. Instead, it's just a really solid read. Well, I think we're done. We talked about books. We began well, we got worse. Isn't that the way life goes? And if you did enjoy, please do like, please do subscribe. Let me know what you read this month. Were there any bangers? Did you read any that I read, just so happenly? And as always, have a nice rest of your day.